So what are we gonna do today, Cousin PW?
The same thing we do every day, Melvin. Try to take over the neighborhood.
Hey y'all, Bloodwing here to bring some grumpiness to your internet, as this is my first attempt at regular content in quite a while, and I hope this signals me getting back to more frequent videos. I thought it fitting to do another Old Farts perspective. This is actually a subject that I've thought about doing for quite a while. I'm finally going to do it now. For my new subscribers, this is a series where I give an opinion piece on recent issues based on historical facts or life experience. Now, over the last several months, I keep hearing from time to time that there's going to be a race war in America. And this is usually due to some riot or something or other performed by Black Lives Matter or even anti-Trump protesters. Racial tension is certainly high right now, but has it never been before? And is it higher now than it's ever been? In an attempt to answer that question, let's take a look at 3 events in America's past. I'll not go into a lot of great detail, but I hope to give enough facts, the basic stuff of each event to get the point across. And there's been many of these events in our history, but I chose the 3 that I did because they may be better known to you. All 3 just happened to have occurred in LA, but I'm not trying to say anything derogatory about LA here. And you will note that I have listed no citations as I usually would. That's because I gathered info from so many places it would be pointless. But trust me, you do a 5-second Google search on any of these events and it'll provide you with more information than you need, probably more than you want. They're all very well documented. So let's jump into this thing, shall we? Okay, so the first event we're going to take a look at is the so-called Zoot Suit riots of June 1943. This one might be lesser known to some of you of the 3 I'll present here, even though there's been a Broadway show and a movie based on that show. And before the jokes pour in, no, I was not alive back then. Ha ha ha. But I wish to include it, not only for its significance, but unlike the other 2, this was not perpetrated by a minority group, but predominantly by whites. To understand this one, we must first take a look at what a zoot suit was. As is so often the case, zoot suits and their female counterparts started as a statement by youths, in this case, disenfranchised Latino youths, as a way of adopting their own subculture. It was a very flamboyant affair, consisting of an almost comically long suit jacket and very baggy pants pegged at the cuff. The pants were most often paired with suspenders, and often pulled up so high they would cover the belly button. To cap off the ensemble, there would be a very long watch chain looping down to the knees and back to the pocket, and topped off with either a fedora or pork pie hat. The hat was at times oversized as well, and with a very long feather stuck in the band. Now obviously, this suit took a lot of material to make. The females of that subculture would often wear skirts with a similar jacket over them, or in some cases, they would actually wear the entire suit. Now remember, this was a much different time and challenging gender roles to the point of a woman wearing men's clothes, or vice versa, just was not done and was considered pretty scandalous. Although it was predominantly Latino, other groups started wearing the suits. Blacks, Filipino, even some white kids here and in the UK. Unfortunately, these kids started to be viewed as thugs or gangsters. And this certainly added to the tension. Shortly before the riots, there was a huge case called the Sleepy Lagoon case, where 9 Zoot Suit youths were charged and convicted of a murder of a man in a quarry. Even though the convictions were later overturned, this also added to the tension. Now, since America was at war at this time, in March of 1942, the War Production Board regulated the manufacture of all clothing using wool. In an attempt to reach a 26% cutback in the use of fabrics, the WPB issued regulations that some called streamlined suits for Uncle Sam. This effectively outlawed the oversized zoot suits. There was a war on, and the country needed the materials in the war effort. But again, as so often happens, the black market kicked in to provide suits to these kids, and many also still had the suits that were made before the regulations. But all these things added up together to cause a great amount of racial stress against these kids. Without going into great detail, the riots broke out when numerous sailors and other servicemen in LA on leave started patrolling the streets armed with makeshift clubs and assaulting anyone wearing a zoot suit, regardless of race in some cases. The suit to them was seen as a slap in the face of our country, using all that regulated material. Adding to the pressure, many of the servicemen came from areas that had limited or zero contact with Latino culture. Many were beaten severely and stripped of their suits. The police actually had orders not to arrest any of the servicemen, and in some cases they actually joined in. By the middle of June, the riots stopped as command staff began confining the men to their barracks. By then, more than 150 people had been injured and over 500 arrested. Most of those arrested were Latino. Next up, let's take a look at the Watts riots of August 1965. The riot, which up until the Rodney King riots, which will be next on our list, was the worst in L.A. The riots were triggered when a black man, Marquette Fry, was suspected of drunk driving and arrested. And an argument broke out involving the officers, Fry, his brother, and his mother on the side of the road there that escalated into a full-blown fight. Crowds gathered, rocks were thrown after the arrests were made. Amidst allegations of police brutality, the neighborhood of Watts in L.A. exploded, both figuratively and literally, into chaos. There were other triggers as well, including police discrimination, but whatever the reasons, from August 11th to the 16th, Watts became a war zone. 16,000 officers were mobilized, joined eventually by 2,300 National Guardsmen. It became a full-scale war. Stores and businesses were looted, firemen and emergency personnel blocked from doing their jobs, white motorists dragged from their cars and beaten. It is estimated that between 31,000 and 35,000 adults participated in the riot. There were 34 deaths, 1,032 injuries, and over $40 million in damages, with almost 1,000 buildings damaged or destroyed. And remember, that's in 1965 money. As bad as this event was, it was easily eclipsed in 1992 by what is often referred to as the Rodney King riots. On March 3, 1991, 2 CHP officers became involved in a high-speed chase when a car driven by Rodney King and carrying 2 passengers refused to pull over for a traffic stop. Speeds of up to 150 miles per hour were reached as the chase went first across LA highways and then into residential areas. Once King was finally stopped, King and his passengers were ordered under arrest. 5 other officers arrived to cart them away. The passengers were placed in police vehicles without incident. But not so for Rodney. He was tased, battered with batons, tackled to the ground, and handcuffed. The officers claimed later that he resisted arrest, and they suspected him to be under the influence of PCP. One of the things that set this incident apart from the previous 2 we've discussed is that it occurred during the infancy of the digital age. Camcorders had become very common by that time, and the entire arrest was videotaped by George Holliday from his apartment window. The media got a hold of this tape, which instantly became national news. I remember watching it myself, and I must admit it was pretty brutal, but not nearly as brutal as what was to come. Eventually, 4 of the 5 officers were brought to trial for assault and excessive force. On April 29, 1992, the jury acquitted all 4. They were later retried, but that was after the riots that erupted due to the acquittals. The unrest began in the 71st and Normandy area with a few rocks thrown, but quickly escalated into full-scale violence, and then spread into other areas. Live broadcasts began on local news, with one station having a helicopter crew filming from the air. This crew caught some of the most enduring and graphic events of the riots, such as what happened to a man named Reginald Denny. At the intersection of Florence and Normandy, the violence took a huge leap up. Larry Tarvin, a white man driving a delivery truck, was pulled from his vehicle and beaten unconscious with his own fire extinguisher. After his truck was looted, a young black man named Rodney rescued him and helped him to move his truck. As they were doing this, the unfortunate Reginald Denny arrived at the intersection in his truck. Denny was pulled from his truck and severely beaten. The beating included a thug named Damian "Football" Williams throwing a cinder block on his head, fracturing his skull in 91 pieces. I remember watching this attack live, as by then it had reached national news, and it is probably one of the most remembered scenes of the riots for many. It is one of the most disturbing things I've ever witnessed, and it seriously haunts me at times to this day. The scene was witnessed on TV by millions. 2 black men, Curtis Yarborough and Bobby Green, separately seen the broadcast, and each on their own rushed to the scene, saving Denny from certain death. Even after years of rehabilitation, Denny's ability to speak and drive were affected. An hour later, another attack was caught on video. Fidel Lopez was pulled from his pickup and seriously beaten. Our hero, Damian Williams, was again involved. As he seemed to have an affinity for bashing people in the head, he smashed Fidel's forehead open with a car stereo. Another person tried to cut off his ear. Fidel survived the attack due to Reverend Benny Newton stepping in and proclaiming, "Kill him, and you have to kill me too." As with Denny, it took years of therapy to recover. At the time, there was special animosity against Korean American stores in the area. And at that time, many of the Korean Americans took up arms and fired them to guard their property from the rioters. As with Watts previously, LA burned. Full-on gun battles were televised. Again, the National Guard was called in, as well as the 7th Infantry Division, and eventually a curfew mandated. 6 days later, at the official end of the riots, 55 people were listed as dead and over 2,000 injured. In all, nearly 20,000 people were arrested due to connections with the riot. Many of the looters were turned in by their own black neighbors. 3,767 buildings were burned, with over $1 billion in damages. Again, this is 1992 money. To put this all in perspective, the recent Charlotte riot, likely the most violent of recent times, produced 45 arrests, 32 people injured, and 1 death, causing an estimated $4.6 million in damages. The Milwaukee riot numbers are almost identical. These both pale in comparison of all 3 of these events I have shown you. Okay, so by now you're probably saying, okay, VW, this is an interesting history lesson and all, but what has this got to do with a possible race war today? everything. It's plain to see that racial tensions have certainly been high before, and judging by the numbers cited in the examples here, even higher. Just as had happened with the riots of the last 2 years, smaller pocket riots also broke out in a few other areas of the country. Then, as now, people feared a race war. Did it happen? Nope. And here, in my opinion, is why. As is evidenced, especially in the 1992 riots, not all blacks or other minorities were down with what was happening. They saw it for what it was, and still is: barbarism. Yes, a few policy changes and this and that come from these events, but by and large, what the rioters were left with, especially in the last 2 examples, was their own neighborhoods destroyed. It took years to rebuild, and in some areas it's never been rebuilt. So the proponents of a race war would not have the full backing of their people. Also, as happened in the latter 2 examples, the National Guard would be called. Maybe even the regular army, as in 1992. Police today also have access to far more advanced military-type training, weapons, and vehicles than they had then. Add to that the enormous amount of armed whites in comparison, and the other side, whoever they might be, would be seriously outgunned and outnumbered. Even Black Hitler's not that stupid. So my answer is no, there will not be a race war. There have been far better opportunity for that in our past, and it didn't happen then, and it won't happen now. Despite the tough talk and rhetoric from both sides, it is just not viable, and any attempt would just be a short-lived skirmish, much like the events cited here. Of course, I could be wrong. I have been before. This is just my opinion based on history and the things I've seen in my over half a century walking on this earth. You are welcome to, and will surely have, your own opinions. Heck, you may even spot flaws in my arguments, I don't know. I only ask that you keep it civil in the comments, and let's leave the racial slurs and prejudice at home this time, okay? But otherwise, by all means, let me know what you think. Anyways, that's it for me this time. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, get out of my yard.